I'll tell you some of the reasons that we decided that the circus was a good subject for us to have as the Fitchburg Historical Society. One of the things was that many of you will probably remember the circus train used to go through Madison on its way to Milwaukee for the circus parade. And in doing so, it went on the tracks that were along the Cyene Road. So many of us used to take our cars down to the Cyene Road and park along the side of the road and observe the train as it came wobbling down the tracks. And I'll never forget how much fun we thought it was to hear the rattle of those train wheels as it was coming, and we'd all get excited, oh yes, the train is coming, and those beautiful wagons that shone in the sunlight with their gilded gold was quite a sight. I even took my big standard poodle with me once, and I was kind of sorry I did because she got afraid of that. And so I thought, never again will I take a dog with me to that lovely thing. But anyway, that was one of the reasons we thought that Fitchburg people might be especially interested in having the circus program today. And another one was that we also knew that Chappie Fox was the former director of the Circus World Museum in Baraboo, and he was a relative of our dear Anna and Philip Fox, who were longtime Fitchburg residents. And the Fox family were some of the early settlers in Fitchburg, and we have a lot of history about their family in this community. And another older Fitchburg resident, Della Tussler, whom many of us knew, was the caretaker of one of the Ringling brothers' wives, but I'm not sure which one, and I can't find anybody older than I am to tell me who it was that she took care of. But I do remember going to see her at Mrs. Ringling's home, and it was a beautiful home, and she was so gracious to us, but I can't remember if it was Mrs. Henry Ringling or which one. But anyway, Della was her caregiver until she passed away. So anyway, these are some of the reasons that the Fitchburg Historical Society thought it was appropriate for us to have this program today. And as I say, I think we've hit the jackpot with their speaker. So anyway, this is a little brief about him. I was trying to memorize this last night and I gave up on it, so I'm going to read it. He was born and raised in Milwaukee, and he earned his degree in mechanical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in 1973, following an 18-year career as a manager of large engineering and construction projects. Fred changed course, however, and raised a hobby pursuit into an occupation. Wasn't that a fun thing to be able to do? Joining Circus World Museum in 1991, he rose to be Director of Facilities and Collections. During the next 13 years, he managed the museum, archival, and artifact collection, as well as the historic and general purpose structures and the 60-acre property. More than 20,000 requests for informational assistance were administered, along with the installation of exhibits, restoration of vehicles and musical instruments, production of 3 books and several dozen articles, 2 CDs of music, and a video documentary about the Ringlings and their circus. In 2005, Fred became the curator of circus history for the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art in Sarasota, Florida. And maybe some of you, have any of you seen that? It's a beautiful place also. Where he has been involved with the inauguration of the Tibbles Learning Center and several publication projects. He was a contributing editor for the 18-pound book, Circus, published by Tyshin, and also wrote the afterword for the 2008 reissue of Henry Ringling North's book, The Circus Kings. He has served the Circus Historical Society as president and trustee. And we're happy to have Anita, Fred's wife, here with us today also. And Fred, we're anxious to hear your program. Fred Dallinger.
Thank you, Kay, for that fine introduction, and thank you to the Fitchburg Historical Society and to the library for having me here. From everything that I've seen and heard so far, I feel tremendous pressure. As I was coming down here, I saw my name in lights for the first time on the road. A friend of ours in Stoughton went past her the other day and said, "What's going on? Your name's in lights." And I thought, I don't know. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I also find it a pleasure that I'm here between two important events. We had the Badger win yesterday. Well, I guess we're going to have a Packer win later today, so that's pretty good. I was trying to think of some other connection between Fitchburg and the circus, and I'm a little bit challenged, but I can tell you that in your midst, until about 2 years ago, was the lady who was the outreach and education director for Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey Circus. And she lived very quietly amongst you here in Fitchburg, but about 2 years ago she relocated down to Florida. But Peggy Williams was the first female graduate of Clown College, which had been established by Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, and she chose to live here in Fitchburg. So even though you didn't know it, you had a very important person from the circus industry right in your midst. Because we have these two football events that are kind of bookmarking, you might say, my presentation today, I thought, well, maybe there's some connection I can give you between the circus and football. And I had to really think about that one. You know, we had football playing elephants and things of that nature, but I guess the one that stuck in my mind, all of you I think are familiar with what a big top is, the great big tent that houses the circus. Well, you know how big a football field is? When you see the NFL game, the Packers playing, you see this 300 or 100-yard long field and so wide. Well, I calculated the square footage of that field, and I divided that into the largest big top that a circus ever used. And what I found is that 2 football fields could fit within the biggest circus big top. So it kind of gives you an idea how big this enterprise was at one time. That big top was about 200 feet wide and over 500 feet long and could seat about 15,000 people at a single performance. In fact, the world record performance in a tent was about 16,000 people in 1924. So we're talking about a huge enterprise. And this enterprise moved 6 days a week, each day to a new community. They arrived by train, unloaded everything, put up their whole array of tents, staged a street parade, 2 performances, fed 1,000 or 1,200 people, tore it all down, loaded it back on a train, and went on to the next city the next day. If any of you are campers, and you know what it's like to go camping, imagine moving a train of 80 cars, 1,200 people, 40 elephants, a whole zoo, all of the apparatus needed to stage a circus and a street parade, and you begin to have an idea of the logistical challenges that showmen faced as they traveled across America. And we in Wisconsin have a very special position in circus history. There are probably more circuses that were originated here in Wisconsin or wintered here than any other state in the Union. And most importantly, the biggest circuses, those that bore the names of Barnum and the Ringling Brothers, can be traced to an origin here in Wisconsin. So today what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of a microcosm about the circus, Wisconsin, and the Ringlings. And just before I start, is there anybody that hasn't heard of the name Ringling before? Everybody? Okay, so I'm pretty safe. So you know that there were a bunch of them, I guess is what we'll start with. So let me maybe start by talking about, what are we talking about when we talk about a circus? Well, we're talking about this wonderful performance within a circular ring. It's people with special skills and trained animals working together to provide an entertainment for humans. It has to have a ring. It has to have several different types of activity, like a horseback rider, acrobats, wire walker, and it can be something that's done on the ground or in the air. It doesn't have to be in a tent, like we're showing here. It can be in a building. It can be before a grandstand. The venue's not important. But what really is important is having that ring that encompasses all of the circus activity. That's really what defines a circus, and that's the origin of the word, is from the word circle. Well, in America, it all starts in 1793 with a Scotsman named John Bill Ricketts. He was trained in circus skills by a man named Hughes in England, came to the United States, and on April 4th, 1793, he originated the circus in America. What he did is he caused a wooden amphitheater, maybe a building, maybe half again as large as this space, to be built with a 40-foot diameter ring, seating around the outside, and that's where he staged his circus. That's the way the business was conducted from 1793 until 1825. In 1825, something that they called the pavilion, which we would probably call a tent today, was first used to house a circus. In the days of Ricketts, they would travel along the eastern seaboard, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, Savannah. The population had not yet moved westward. But as Americans moved towards the inland area, it wasn't possible to build these buildings and have a show there. So a guy named J. Purdy Brown from upstate New York decided I should use a tent, and I can move this tent day by day to a different community and thereby engage the people with our circus. And that's exactly what he did. So starting in 1825, we start to see the use of the pavilion or the tent, and these circuses start to move overland. They loaded the tent, the poles, the people into carriages, wagons, omnibuses, and have them drawn by horses from one community to the other. And that was the beginning of the Overland Circus. And what happened as the population started to move further west towards the mid-19th century, the density of the population started to be high enough that circuses could come west and start to show out here. So you started to see these shows from upstate New York would travel by horse and wagon all the way across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and guess what? About 1847, they reached Wisconsin. And a show operated by a man named Samuel Nichols brought the first circus to Racine in, August 11th, 1843. First circus in the state. He came all the way here from Albany, New York. Now, an interesting thing is a menagerie followed that show. A menagerie is a traveling menagerie, and it went to Madison. And it was, just one of the things that they were going to do, visiting a number of communities within the state. But the interesting thing is we were not yet the state of Wisconsin. This group of people came together to start to write the Constitution and so on. But that day, when the menagerie arrived in Madison, that group of people adjourned their business and they all went to see the menagerie. What they wanted to do was to show these people who had come from so far away how hospitable the people of our state were. And I'd like to think that's kind of the beginning of our tourist business. We show our hospitality to all the people that come from elsewhere to our state. Well, what happened, one of the shows that came here was owned by the Mabee brothers. There were two brothers, Edmund and Jeremiah. They were out of Putnam County, New York. It's an area just above New York City a little bit. And they came out here and they went to Delavan, just by chance. And they saw that beautiful rolling countryside that characterizes southern Wisconsin. But the interesting thing about that rolling countryside is it's not the best for planting crops. If you're a farmer, you prefer to have nice level property because your horses can pull the plow that much easier back and forth. Our rolling countryside makes it probably better for pasture land, but it also makes it cheaper land. It's cheaper than the flatlands of Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. So circus men coming up there to Wisconsin took a look from Delavan, looked out across that beautiful lake there and said, you know what, this would be a perfect place to have a circus winter quarters. Because what happened until that time, they'd start out in upstate New York, they'd travel west at about 4 or 5 miles an hour, which is the walking speed of a horse. And by the time they got out here in the midsummer, guess what? They'd have to turn back to reach back to their winter quarters in New York before winter set in. So somebody had the revolutionary idea, well, why don't we just move to Wisconsin, and then we could play the whole Midwest all summer. And the Mabee brothers were the first to do that, and they established their winter quarters in Delavan, Wisconsin. Subsequent to them, there were probably 30 other different groups of owners that started shows in that little small town of Delavan, Wisconsin. I think one of you came up today and introduced me as being from Delavan, so you have an awareness of that great heritage. That heritage lasted from 1847 on up to 1894 and had a very profound impact on other shows coming to Wisconsin and starting their business here in this state, including the Ringland Brothers. In time, the Mabee brothers decided to exit the business, and in 1865, they decided to sell out, they sold to this gentleman named Adam Forepaugh. He was originally a butcher. Later on, he bought and sold horses that were used on trolley cars or horse cars in the cities of Cincinnati and Philadelphia. The interesting thing about Adam Forepaugh, and that's his circus there on the right, shown in a stereo view taken in Racine about 1869. Adam Forepaugh grew that Maybe menagerie into the largest circus in America at that time. This was even in the time of P.T. Barnum. Adam Forepaugh had an equally large and splendid circus, but most of you probably have never heard of Adam Forepaugh until today. Well, interesting thing, Adam Forepaugh also hired a clown named Dan Rice, a humorist who maybe some of you have heard of. He paid him the unheard of sum of $1,000 a week to work for him in 1864, 1865. That was just a huge amount of money. The interesting thing and why I'm bringing these two names up is they play a later role in the formation and the prosperity of the Ringling Brothers Circus. After the Mabee Brothers, the most important circus to come out of Delavan was P.T. Barnum's Greatest Show on Earth. This is a poster from about 1879, I believe. But it gives you some idea of all the many attractions of the circus. What happened, there were two Delavan showmen named Dan Costello and W.C. Coop who had operated a circus on their own in 1870. They had this equipment stored in Delavan, and they contacted P.T. Barnum, who had recently retired from his museum business in New York City. And they said, how would you like to join us with a circus? And he wrote back and said, essentially, guys, this is a great idea, let's plan to do it. Well, they started out with 10 carloads of equipment that they shipped out of Delavan to New York City, and they framed probably the largest overland circus to that time, and it toured in 1871. In 1872, they decided they wanted to put it on a railroad train. And in that way, what they were able to do was to roll from one big city to another. They were not dependent upon that walking gait of the horse to go from one city to another. Within 2 years, they had the first $1 million season in the American circus business. And all of that started right out of Delavan, Wisconsin. Now, when we talk about our state's heritage, we can point to about 30 different communities around the state that have hosted a circus winter quarters or served as a point of origin for a circus. You've got Delavan, Beaver Dam, Fort Atkinson, Avoca, Baraboo, Prairie du Sac, about 30 different communities that have hosted circus activity. Now, the natural question asked is, well, why these cities? You know, what's special about them for the circus? And quite frankly, the answer is there's probably nothing special about them except that's where the people lived, that's where they found conditions right to host the wintertime show, kind of things that were ancillary to the basic and primary circus business. But nonetheless, we had more cities involved in the circus business than any other state in the Union. And it forms a very unique heritage for the state of Wisconsin. I'll tell you a little bit about a few of these shows. Burr Robbins was a showman out of Janesville, Wisconsin. He came here from Paw Paw, Michigan, and established his show there in 1874, operated it through about 1887, was one of the largest railroad shows in the country. He ended up towards the end of his career also selling some of his properties to the very early Ringling Brothers Circus. Another very interesting showman was a black man, Ephraim Williams. He started the first show in 1888 out of Appleton. Later he had a show out of Medford, Wisconsin, and another one out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's very unusual for an African American to have been able to organize a circus and to operate it in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s. And as far as I know, he's the only African American who was able to do that from what we've been able to learn so far. Another very interesting circus was the Fun on the Farm show that was put together by attorney John M. Kelly. Kelly was the private attorney for the Ringling Brothers and was also the corporate attorney for the show. And in 1924, he put together this kind of promotional circus that played the county fair circuit. They were advocating for various things in the legislature for the dairy industry. The interesting thing about Kelly is he lived in New York City at that time, and he cultivated a very close friendship with Babe Ruth, the famous baseball player. And I recently had the pleasure to visit with John's son, Pat, who lives in Florida now and is moving on to his 100th birthday. And he told me that yes, at his 10th birthday party, his dad had invited Babe Ruth to his party. And he went to see his teacher and said, you know, Babe Ruth is going to be at my birthday party. Do you think it'd be okay if you let, you know, all my buddies here come over to my birthday party? Well, as you can imagine, Pat was a very popular boy. And the funny thing that happened is yesterday in the Baraboo News Republic, one of our local historians wrote a little article about the Fun on the Farm circus, and there was a picture of Babe Ruth seated on this giant Holstein bull, you know, all part of the Fun on the Farm. I guess what they actually did for the circus, they took this one bull and they actually dyed it green, which is probably not a good thing to do, but they did have the green bull. A little bit of a sad note, our heritage as a circus hosting state kind of reached a landmark on October 10th. A friend of mine, Bill Griffith, who's shown here on the right with his wife Dolores, passed away. Bill was the last three-ring circus operator living in the state of Wisconsin. There's nobody after him. And so it was really a loss when I heard Bill had passed on. He operated some very interesting motorized circuses, operating with a tent, with a three-ring operation. And someday, if you want to invite me back, we'll tell you all about some of the stories of Bill Griffith and his circus, because they're really kind of interesting. Just to give you a little bit of an insight, when Bill was in high school, he bought himself a printing press and hired his classmates to go to work for him. So by the time he graduated from high school, he already had a flourishing printing business going on, and eventually went on to acquire about 20 newspapers here in the state. And for those of you who get the Wisconsin State Journal, you probably saw Bill's obituary, I think around October 11th, it was in the paper. So that kind of leads us from a vast array of different kinds of shows to the Ringling family, which is probably one of the primary things you want to hear about today. So let me give you a little bit of insight about the Ringling family. And probably the best place to start is with their parents. The parents of the Ringling brothers were August Ringling, who was an immigrant from Germany, and his wife Salome Juliar, who came from Alsace-Lorraine. They both emigrated to this continent. August came via Canada, Salome came via the Great Lakes, and they both ended up in Milwaukee, which is where they met and which is where they were married. This picture is probably from about the time of the marriage, thereabouts. Don't really know for sure, but they look kind of like maybe a happy couple, but they're probably simply because of the cameras of the time. August was a maker of handmade leather goods, buckets, straps, whatever you might need in terms of leather goods. That was his trade. The problem was that the business was then converting over to machine-made leather goods. So he found it very, very difficult to gain gainful employment. He looked in many different areas. And through time, the family moved from Milwaukee to Chicago temporarily, up to Baraboo, where one of Salome's brothers or sisters lived. They then went to McGregor, Iowa, Stillwater, Minnesota, back to Baraboo, Rice Lake, Wisconsin, and eventually back to Baraboo. All the time he was looking for employment. The reason he was looking for employment is they had 10 children, and that's quite a few people to take care of. 8 of those children lived to adulthood. It was 7 sons and 1 daughter. I think what we'll do, let's talk first about the 5 brothers that organized and formed the circus, and then we'll talk about the other 2 sons that they had. Well, the most important of the brothers was Al Ringling. He was the oldest. He was the one that really pushed the idea of the circus with his brothers. As a young man, he taught himself acrobatic skills, how to walk a tightrope. He balanced a breaking plow on his chin. He taught himself how to train animals. He gained all of these skills. So what he kind of developed was a natural forte for dealing with performance. And as the brothers formed their circus, he took over management of the show performance. One of the advances that he made was to replace the bell, like a school marm's bell, that used to signal the change of acts in the big top. He introduced the use of that piercing P whistle. So whenever you think of the whistle at the circus, that's something that Al Ringling decided to implement. The other thing that Al did is he could look at an act and figure out what were the good parts of it, what were the not so good parts of it, and he sliced it and diced it until it became a very fast-moving, very fast-paced act. So he gained a lot of recognition for his ability to manage a show. In fact, shortly before his death on January 1st, 1916, he was given a commendation by the Wisconsin State Legislature recognizing him as America's foremost showman, which I think is quite an honor. The picture on the right there shows Al with a group of Liberty ponies, probably about 1888, 1889. The next brother in line was Otto. Otto was known as the king. He was the king of finances. Otto was the guy that managed the money around the show. When it came to doing contracts, he was the guy that signed the contracts. He was really the financial wizard of the show. A lot of you are aware that recently our country has experienced a very severe financial crisis. Well, the same sort of thing happened in 1907. And in 1907, that was the year that the Ringling Brothers bought the Barnum and Bailey Circus and everything that went with it. The cost was just $510,000. But Otto went to banks in New York City, Chicago, St. Louis, and nobody had that kind of money to loan. And finally, he was able to get the money at a reasonable rate, which made possible the purchase of the Barnum and Bailey show by the Ringling Brothers. And you say, well, why is that important? Well, it was a circus equal to their own, and through their improved management, the brothers were able to pay back that $510,000 of money in the very first year of operation. 100% payback. Any of you want to go in the circus business? Yeah, it really says a lot about Otto, the financial wizard. The picture on the right there shows him at the rear platform of his private railroad car that he traveled with on the circus, and the gentleman with him there is Charlie Hutchison, who was the treasurer on the show. Next in line was Alf T. Ringling. Alf T. was kind of a dreamer sort of a fellow. Probably that served him well as he thought up much of the advertising for the circus. And if you read that bill about the giraffe, the last to be seen by human eyes, have any of you seen a giraffe? Well, some of it was a bit inventive, I would say, and stretched the truth maybe a little bit. But Alf T is an interesting guy. When the airplanes first came about, he had the idea, we ought to put the circus and take it off the railroad cars and put it into airplanes. We can really go past from big city to big city that way. Unfortunately, I don't think anybody has succeeded with an actual management plan to be able to do that. But it kind of gives you some idea about Alf T and the kind of way he thought about reality. He was also a writer. He wrote a book about the history of the brothers and their circus ambitions around 1900. I don't know if it was his imagination, but for some reason he and his wife Della were divorced. He was the only brother that was divorced. To give you some insight on that action, two of the reasons that Della gave for divorcing her husband was that number one, he compelled her to sometimes travel with him on the circus, and number two, sometimes he brought people home from the circus and she had to make dinner for them. So things like that happen, I guess. Charlie Ringling was probably the most affable and friendliest of all the Ringling brothers. The picture there shows him with another circus owner, a gentleman named Andrew Downey, whose real name was McPhee. But Charlie was the kind of guy you could go up to on the lot and ask him for a job or something like that. He was the general manager of the circus. So after it got unloaded from the train and got to the grounds, he was the man responsible from early dawn until late at night to make sure that everything went okay. That the performance was on, the street parade went out, 1,200 meals were served 3 times a day. Anybody having unpaid bills, if their car got hit by a team of horses that ran away, if there was some problem with the license for the lot, all those things Charlie had to tend to. And if you think about it, being on call literally all day, 6 days a week,
if you didn't have an affable personality, a job like that would probably consume you. So Charlie was known as being probably the nicest guy amongst all of the Ringling brothers. John Ringling is the one that probably most of you know the most about because of the museum that stands today down in Florida. It includes his mansion, Kadzan, an art gallery, circus museum, the grounds itself, and so on. And probably most people think in terms of John being this imperial guy that he kind of comes across there in the right side picture. Actually, John's kind of a tragic figure. He was the last of the brothers to survive. He outlived Charlie by 10 years, from 1926 to 1936. John reached the pinnacle of the circus business in 1907 when they bought the Barnum Bailey Show. Up until that time, James A. Bailey of the Barnum Bailey Show had kind of been the arbiter of what went on in the circus business in the United States. When Bailey died, the attention turned to John. The general agents of the shows would meet early in the year, and they would essentially say what circus could play what part of the country at what time during the season. That was all within John's domain. And he did that for the next 20 years for the various shows that they operated. And then in 1929, something happened that caused him to purchase 5 other circuses that belonged to the American Circus Corporation. John became the owner of 6 large railroad circuses. That had never happened before in the history of the circus business anywhere on earth. And guess what? Within 3 years, John had a cash flow problem, defaulted on paying the interest on the loan that he had to buy those circuses, and all of those shows were taken away from his control. So he goes from literally the pinnacle to the bottom, and was kind of treated with disrespect by the people that took over his circus enterprises. So even though John has kind of a imperial majesty about him, he somewhat cultivated a reputation as being one of the richest men in America, which he wasn't. Yet the long part of the story is that he's really a tragic figure in the circus history. There's 2 other brothers that were not part of the original 5 that started the circus. One was the youngest member of the family, Henry. He was the baby boy, probably got spoiled a little bit. He was also the giant of the family. He stood a little bit taller than me and probably weighed 100 pounds more than I do, so he was a great big hulking guy. One of his nephews termed him Beetlebrowed, as though he had kind of a sinister look to him. But in reality, the people that knew Henry told me he was a very gentle, very kind-hearted man. The other thing that comes across about Henry, though, is when he was first given responsibility on the show about 1887 to go out in advance of it to publicize the show, he fell victim to liquor and went on a bender and ended up hocking his horse, his wagon, his clothes. It was a very sad story. And forever after, his brothers really didn't give him a lot of responsibility. He generally sat at the front door of the circus, making sure the ticketing operations went okay. And it wasn't until 1905, almost 20 years later, that they empowered him to be a manager of one of their subsidiary circuses. Another thing that happened with Henry, most of the brothers bought property in Florida in the 1910s, usually in the Sarasota area. Henry and his wife, apparently to be separate from his other brothers, they bought property over near Orlando, a little town called Eustis. No, it's not the property that became developed as Disney World and all that sort of thing. No great riches from it. But it set him apart from his other brothers because of that past experience. The other brother who was not part of the original founding brothers was Gus, or AG as he went by his initials. Gus took off from home early, got conventional employment up in Minnesota. He met a real sweet French-Canadian girl named Annie up there. They married, had children, but I guess the brothers made him an offer he couldn't refuse. In 1890, when they decided to go from an overland operation into a railroad circus operation, they brought Gus on to manage their railroad advertising car, which as you can see in the right-hand picture. See that? Gus did this in a very exemplary fashion. If you can imagine, there is nobody better to go out in advance of your circus testifying to the quality of the operation than somebody bearing the name of the circus. So when Gus would leave the railroad car and go see the newspaper editor, he could honestly introduce himself and say, "Hello, I'm Mr. Ringling. Let me tell you about our circus." And he was able to do that up through the time he passed away in 1907. Well, beyond all the men, there's also some Ringling women that are deserving of notice. The one that probably sticks out the most in my mind is Louise Ringling. This was the wife of the oldest brother, Al. They got to know each other at a social function in Baraboo, where she came to town and was visiting with friends. And over a period of time, they got to know one another very well, and they became a couple. Marriage took place a little bit later in the future, but they were a couple. The interesting thing about Louise is she really believed in being part of the circus. She not only charmed the snakes in the sideshow, she rode a horse in the ring, and when necessary, she would drive a wagon overland from one community to another. Now imagine any of you driving a two-horse team pulling two wagons as it's heading back to Baraboo at the end of the season. And it gives you some idea about Louise and the grit that she had for the circus. And during the winter, she would work in one of the upstairs rooms in downtown Baraboo, helping to create wardrobes for the circus. So her commitment to the show was year-round. The other lady who became part of the circus was Charlie's wife, Edith. She was a school teacher from Minnesota that he came to know. Her part of the circus was not like Louise's. She became active later on. After her husband Charles died in 1926, she inherited his 1/3 interest in the circus. 1/3 was still owned by John, 1/3 was owned by Edith, another third was owned by Alf T's son, Richard. It turns out what happened in 1932, Edith and Richard's widow, Aubrey Ringling, got together and they voted John out of office. And that was part of the whole story of what happened to the Ringling brothers in the 1930s. But Edith became a very strong figurehead representing the family on the Ringling Circus on up through the 1940s and 1950s. And if you think in terms of Mom, Apple Pie, Chevrolet, and the American Circus, Edith Ringling would kind of be exemplifying a female owner of the American Circus, a very highly regarded person in the business. We've got 5 brothers who own the circus, 2 brothers that later came and joined it, 2 women that were very much part of it. But what are the kind of things that we might take away in terms of wisdom from the experience of the Ringling brothers and their circus? Henry Ringling North, who was a nephew to the brothers, he was one of the 2 sons of Ida, the young lady there in the front row, who was the one daughter of the Ringling brothers. Henry wrote a book about the family experience and said, you know, it wasn't that they were such great guys. He said, there's just so damn many of them. I think we all understand the principle of strength in numbers. These boys, though, were exceptional in their commitment to each other. I think in terms of abiding love, in the feeling that they had for one another. I mean, it was a very, very strong bond that they had. Whenever they signed their business correspondence, they didn't sign it Al Ringling or Otto Ringling or John Ringling. They signed it Ringling Brothers, B-R-O-S, period. It really projected an image of we are together in this enterprise. If you look at their posters, they had these overlapping portraits of the 5 brothers. You know, it was kind of saying, you pick out one of us, you're going to get all 5 of us in your face. So they had a very much unified presentation in the business of the circus. The other thing you might find interesting, especially if you're of a legal mind, the brothers never incorporated the circus to give them personal protection from whatever happened at the circus. In other words, if somebody tripped and fell and filed a lawsuit, they themselves were going to be personally liable for whatever happened at the circus. Now, you might not think this is significant, but if there had been a very tragic accident at the show at any time during the period before they were incorporated, they would have stood the personal liability of that operation. They basically lived by word of bond amongst the 5 brothers that we are in this enterprise together. We will do whatever it takes. We're going to plow all of our profits back into the show. We're not going to have outside interests. Very, very strong bond between these brothers. one of the things that they did was they embraced the concept of Sunday school showmen. You say, what's Sunday school showmen? They don't show on Sundays. Well, in the period after, well, actually starting during the Civil War into the 1870s, even into the 80s and 90s, corruption was rife in America. Suppliers to the Civil War effort would supply substandard, under quantity supplies, not meet the contract. When they built the Brooklyn Bridge, one of the men supplying the wire for the Brooklyn Bridge supplied off-spec wire. He brought the wagon loads of wire back and took them out the other door of the factory and sent them right back to the Brooklyn Bridge. These kinds of things were rife in our country. Corruption is not something new or recent. It was present way back when. And it was present around the circus. If you wanted to gamble at some circuses, you could do that. They had some ticket wagons where the window ledge was up high. You couldn't see your change. They just put it on there and you scooped it off. Well, if it fell on the ground or they shortchanged you, that was part of the circus experience. Well, the Ringling Brothers changed all of that. They hired private detectives that traveled with their show. They rooted out pickpockets. They made sure that their ticket sellers were honest, gave you back all the change you were due, and they made the circus lot someplace safe for families, for women, for children to visit. And so people that were not of their mindset nicknamed them Sunday school showmen, as these are these namby-pamby guys. Well, guess what? They came to dominate the business. The other guys, they lost. So even on their checks, you can see that they use that slogan, founders of the new school of American showmen. And that gave rise to this slogan of Sunday school showmen. It was just one of the things they did to make the circus business better in America. Well, we're back to the family again. One of the things I'd like to say that, you probably find it difficult to get your families together for Thanksgiving, for Christmas. And the Ringling Brothers found it difficult also. John took off for Chicago right away, and the other brothers had travel interests of one sort or another. So what they tried to do was once a year around Christmas time, they would all get together at Father and Mother Ringling's home. They'd have their meal together, and then the brothers would retreat to a room somewhere, and that's where they would have their annual planning meeting for the circus. That's where they set forth the plans of who they wanted to hire, what features they were going to have, where they were going to go, make all these important decisions. The interesting thing about these meetings was, even though they had this very, very strong bond, all of these discussions were very, very difficult. They argued very, very diligently for one position or another. But what they did, once they took a vote on an issue, that was it. Everybody else abandoned their minority positions and majority ruled within their jurisdiction. They never went back and said, well, I wish we'd have done that, or we should have done that. They went straight ahead. And I think that was one of the reasons for their great successes. They all coalesced to get behind one thought, one purpose, one duty. And I think that made them essentially invincible to other shows and showmen. Well, what about the next generation? People often wonder, if this generation did well, what's going to happen in the next generation? That's something that's probably not a total success story amongst the Ringling Brothers. One of the first of the children, Richard Ringling, was probably what I would term a bit of a spoiled child. He was raised in that broken household of Alf T. and Della Ringling in Baraboo, New Jersey. I have a feeling that he probably got everything he wanted in an attempt to make up for whatever he was lacking in his home life. The thing that happened with Richard is he also started his own motorized circus in 1917 called the R.T. Richards Circus. It was part wagon and horse, part early truck, part walking overland, and unfortunately it was not a success. And I think once the other brothers saw that it was not a success, they tried to kind of keep him on the side. His uncle John had bought a ranch out in Montana near White Sulphur Springs, and he gave that to Richard and kind of got Richard moved out of the circus and out in Montana. That ranch still survives today in Ringling family ownership. Richard's son Paul owns and operates that ranch out there today, very successfully, I might say. Another one of the next generation of Ringlings was Robert Ringling. On the left you see him with his father Charles. On the right you see him as he portrayed himself in Grand Opera. He went on to school at Northwestern University in Chicago, became an opera singer, and actually did very well as an opera singer. But you'll remember Edith Ringling, one of those Ringling women? Well, she finally prevailed and was able to get Robert installed as president of the circus. The only problem was the timing was bad. This occurred about 1940, 1941, right on the cusp of World War II. And then as we moved into World War II, traveling the circus became much more difficult, as you can imagine. But the real tragedy of Robert's life was he was the president of the circus when the show had the Big Top Fire in Hartford, Connecticut in 1944. There were 168 people that lost their life. Nothing like it had ever happened in the circus business before. And Robert really bore the responsibility, but he was never indicted and never charged specifically with a crime in regard to that event. But as a sensitive person, it broke him and broke his spirit. And it also finished his career as a circus owner, as a circus manager. He departed except for a figurehead position, which was taken over by one of his cousins. The two people in the next generation that really took over the circus and made what it became up through the 1960s and 1970s were John and Henry Ringling North. If you remember that one lone girl, Ida, in that family picture, these are her two sons. John, kind of a dandy. He was really spoiled by his Uncle John. If you think about it, he's named for his uncle. He's not named for his father, Henry North. The second son was named for Henry North. And it kind of gives you some insight that John Ringling played a very prominent role in the boys' lives, and he truly did, most importantly on John. These two guys were really raised in splendor. They were raised in Baraboo in Al Ringling's big mansion, which is just off from the square a little bit, the great big brownstone house in Baraboo. They went from there to a house on Bird Key off Sarasota, which had been built by John Ringling to serve as a Southeast White House for the President of the United States. And when the President, Harding, died, there was no purpose for it after that, so Ida and her sons moved down to Sarasota and they lived down there. These two boys went on to marry, I guess we'd call them movie stars or beautiful women various times. But they still had kind of an ingrained responsibility or streak about them. John Ringling North was made the executor of his Uncle John's will. But what John did towards the end of his life, John Ringling, he cut John North entirely out of the proceeds of the will, but left him with the management of the will. That caused something very important to happen. It gave him zero wealth and a lot of responsibilities. And I think John Ringling, in his way, realized that John North was cut for this role. And within a period from 1936 to 1938, John North figured out how to gain control of the circus, which was then controlled by other people. He figured out how to do it. He eventually was able to get all of John Ringling's assets out of hock. And believe me, when I say out of hock, it took 13 years, took until 1949 before they were finally able to settle all of the debts, all the tax liability, all the obligations of John Ringling's estate. 13 years he was at it. So it gives you some idea into what kind of man John Ringling North was. He secured control of the circus in 1938, he lost it in 40, he gained it back in 45, and from then on there was no stopping him. He owned the circus until it was sold to the Feld brothers several decades later. So very pivotal man in terms of carrying on the Ringling heritage. Well, how about the Ringling Circus itself? I talked about the guys behind it and some of their character traits and things like that. Well, Ringling Brothers World's Greatest Shows, as we know it, started in 1884 and existed through 1918. It all started in McGregor, Iowa. In the 1860s, the brothers were living there with their parents, and guess what? the Dan Rice Circus and another circus owned by a gentleman named Stowe came up the river and erected its tents on the riverbanks there in McGregor. And of course, boys who were part of a poverty-stricken family, guess what, the circus? Hey, we gotta go see that thing. Well, they didn't have any money. It turned out the strong man of the circus, a gentleman named Andrew Gaffney, had a leather harness that he used to support a pole, much like a flagpole, except at the top of his pole was an acrobat that did various gyrations. Well, there was something ill or wrong with this harness that he had, and he came to see Father Ringling. You remember the leather goods maker? Well, he repaired the harness for Andrew Gaffney. Andrew, in turn, gave him a bunch of tickets so his family could go to the circus. Well, that was a pivotal day in the Ringling Brothers' existence. From that day forward, the only thing that they could think of was circus. For them, the circus would become the vehicle by which they would escape the poverty that they had when they were living here in McGregor. So seeing Dan Rice, seeing Andrew Gaffney, pivotal time in the existence of these young boys. Well, they taught themselves all these skills, how to sing, how to dance, acrobatics, comedian, kind of a little bit of everything. And they put together a little variety show, and they started touring little halls starting in 1882. They'd have probably loved to come and play here before you folks. This is about the right size place. They would have a little stage. They'd probably do 10 or 12 different turns, probably charge a dime or 25 cents. They did that for 2 years, just playing all these shows day after day, accumulating money for the day when they could open a circus. They finally had enough money in 1884 where they opened a little tent circus in Baraboo in May of that year. And what they did, because nobody had ever heard of the Ringling Brothers then, they brought in a guy named Yankee Robinson. Yankee had owned a very large circus in the 1860s. Al Ringling and John Ringling actually spent some time working for him in the 1870s. So it was an older gentleman, well known in the country, and they put his name ahead of Ringling Brothers. Yankee Robinson and Ringling Brothers double show. Only time that some other name appeared in front of theirs. But that was the beginning of the Ringling Brothers Circus as a very modest overland horse and wagon show. By 1889, they'd accumulated enough money they could start to buy some fancy parade wagons, and they bought this band wagon that you see coming down the street. It had been built for Burr Robbins in Janesville, and they were able to buy it in 1889. And they continued to expand the circus. They had some bad luck one year, 1888, they nearly went out of business because of all the wet weather that year. But they prospered, they worked very hard. They each adopted a certain role within the business. I think I told you that Al took care of the performance, John took care of the routing, Alf T took care of the advertising and publicity, Otto took care of the finances, and who did I leave out? Alf T, Al, Charles, John, Otto. Yes, we got them all. Okay. But they prospered, and they built their show up, and what they were able to do, in 1890, they were able to go see Adam Forepaugh. Remember Adam Forepaugh, the guy that bought the Baby Menagerie out of Delavan? Well, he had a very large circus, and he was in his declining years. He decided to start selling some of it off. He sold the Ringling Brothers most of the railroad train that they would use to travel starting in 1890. They started out with 18 cars in 1890. By 1897, they had reached almost 60 cars. Huge increase in expansion, triple in that short period of time. Had never before happened in United States history. Well, what happens when you're doing really good, people take notice. And in the circus business, the man that took notice was James A. Bailey. You know, Barnum and Bailey? This is that Bailey. If you look very closely, and unfortunately you can't see it real well, but there's a line right here. This line represents the actual comparative size of the Barnum and Bailey shows, 64 cars, 4 trains. And this line, the Little Baraboo Show, 27 cars. Well, I don't know if you think about size matters or not, but in 1892, the Barnum and Bailey Show decided that was the way to show the difference between their gigantic enterprise on 64 cars and this Little Baraboo Show of 27 cars. So only 3 years after becoming a railroad show, they were already coming to the notice of the most important showman in the country. Well, a lot of stuff happened between 1892 and the turn of the century. In 1895, the Ringling Brothers started to invade Chicago for the first time. They started with a spring opener at the Coliseum in Chicago. And in the next 2 decades, they garnered a reputation of being Chicago's circus, which is pretty interesting given that they're coming out of little old Baraboo, about 5,000 people, and staging their circus in the midst of the huge metropolis of Chicago. In 1898, they leased a second circus from the John Robinson family of Cincinnati, Ohio. That gave them 2 circuses to operate for the very first time. And then the most incredible thing happened. In 1898, James A. Bailey decided, I'm going to take my circus to Europe. He left the United States for 5 years. The Ringling Brothers essentially had the whole United States to go wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And when James A. Bailey came back in 1903, he didn't do it very profitably, whereas the Ringling Brothers continued to go on very profitably and made a lot of money. One of the outcomes of the battle between James A. Bailey and the Barnum and Bailey Show and the Ringling Brothers and their world's greatest shows came to a head in 1905 when some of the people that were in ownership positions on the Four Paw Cells Circus decided to sell out. Bailey bought the whole show, and the afternoon of that sale sold half of it to the Ringling Brothers. So at that point in time, they were essentially on an equal footing with James A. Bailey, each owning one big circus and half of another circus. And then one of those things happened that nobody would foresee. James A. Bailey died in 1906 in the springtime. And what that meant is it left the Barnum and Bailey Show without a strong leadership. There was a caretaker administration that took care of the show through 1906 and into 1907. But it was very clear the show needed to be sold, new leadership was needed, and there truly was only one group of people that could manage a show like that, and that was the Ringling Brothers. So believe it or not, on the day when the panic of 1907 broke, the day that there was a run on the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York City, the board of directors of Barnum and Bailey Limited in London, England, voted to approve the sale of Barnum and Bailey to the Ringling Brothers. And that set forth their rise to becoming truly the kings of the American circus business. They ended up at that time owning their own Ringling Brothers Circus, Barnum and Bailey Greatest Show on Earth, the Four Paw Cells Circus, which was the 3rd largest circus, so they got the 3 biggest shows in the country. They also own the physical plant for the Buffalo Bills Wild West, the biggest Wild West show on earth. And they also had leases for winter quarters in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and another over in England. And they also had a leasehold on Madison Square Garden so that no other show could go in there ahead of them. So they were truly the kings of the circus world as 1908 started. In 1909, Al Ringling realized the ambition of his lifetime. What he wanted to do, you remember that pea whistle? He wanted to blow that pea whistle to open Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey World's Greatest Shows in Madison Square Garden. And that's why this poster reads, first time in New York, Ringling Brothers World's Greatest Shows. They did that so Al Ringling could blow that whistle to open his own show in Madison Square Garden. By the way, they lost a ton of money shipping their circus from Baraboo to New York and shipping the Barnum and Bailey Show from Connecticut out to Chicago. They probably lost $50,000 to $75,000 a piece, so they never did that again. Al got to blow his whistle. Well, the Ringling Brothers prospered through the 1910s. This is a picture of the Ringling Show up in, I think it's Red Wing, Minnesota. Yeah. 1915. And it gives you some idea of how immense these traveling enterprises were. There's that huge big top with 3 rings and 2 stages. The second biggest tent is the menagerie or the traveling zoo. There's a sideshow there where you can see all the banners. And there's probably 30 other tents that were erected each and every day. So the Ringlings got 2 shows like this traveling around the country, moving 6 days a week from April to November. You know, huge enterprise, huge undertaking. But what happened is the brothers started dying. Gus passed away in 1907, Otto in 1911, Al in 1916, and Henry finally passed away in the late part of 1918. And And it became clear that they didn't have the resources amongst themselves to manage these two big circuses on their own. There was also the problem of America was going into World War I. And if you think about it, these two circuses each took 8 locomotives and 4 train crews to move each circus every day, day in, day out. 16 locomotives and 8 crews were dedicated to moving these two circuses. And the United States Railway Administration consulted and said, you know, we really can't delegate that kind of resource to moving circuses. So for 1919, the two great circuses, Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey, were combined into one huge enterprise, Ringling Brothers Barnum Bailey Combined Shows. Each of the shows had originally been on about 80 to 84 cars. By 1923, they had increased the size to 100 cars, a number that had never been reached before by any circus anywhere. It was the greatest thing you could possibly imagine in its day. Well, part of the merger was a change in locations. Ringling Brothers had been in Baraboo, which is shown in the quarters there on the left. These buildings are still standing in Baraboo today. They relocated from that wintry location in Baraboo out to Bridgeport, Connecticut on Long Island Sound. Just as cold a place, but it had a larger quarters with more buildings that could more readily handle this one large circus. But what happened is Charlie, the second last of the brothers, he died in 1926. So it fell upon John to decide where we're going to keep our circus. Well, starting in 1912, John had started to buy property in Sarasota, Florida. He continued to invest, starting in the late 1910s, to buy investment property. And then in the mid-1920s, there was a Florida land boom bust. And he felt that he needed to do something to shore up the financial aspects of Florida. So what he did was he relocated the circus from wintry Bridgeport, Connecticut, down to Sarasota, Florida. And if you're fortunate, not like we usually are, we usually go to Florida when it's 50 degrees and 50-mile-an-hour winds. But usually Florida is pretty balmy during the wintertime. And that's how the circus got to Florida, was through John Ringling's involvement. And it's pretty much been a Florida institution from 1927 unto today. They left Sarasota in 1960, actually didn't have a quarters for a while, then went to Venice for about 30 years, and now today they're in a little community called Palmetto, Florida, which is just northeast of Sarasota. Well, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey Circus in the 1920s was a gigantic institution. It's this tent that you see the interior of here that could house 2 NFL regulation football fields underneath its canvas expanse. They could show to 15,000 people at a single performance. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. And as I said, the last of the brothers to live was John Ringling. John passed away in 1936. He was no longer in command of his circus empire. He had been pretty much cast aside by the people who had taken over. And it was really a tragic story in terms of the last years of John's life. But the circus continued on. It was eventually taken over by the North Brothers that you saw earlier, and they continued to operate it until selling it to Irvin and Israel Feld and Judge Roy Hoffines in the late 1960s. And that family still owns Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey today. They still have 2 troops in operation moving by railroad, and they have a hometown edition that moves by motorized truck over the highways, and they've had other operations in addition to that. They are the world's largest operator of traveling shows. So it's an enormous enterprise today. It's a $1 billion plus corporation today. I think the last time I saw a statistic, they were operating in something like 43 different countries on 4 different continents. So it's a huge enterprise. And it all started out of the circus in Wisconsin. The only other thing I'd like to say about the circus is the circus of today. I think it's in a healthy mode. It's got the Ringling shows. It has stellar artistic shows like the Big Apple Circus. Today there are more amateur circuses and circus training schools in existence than there's ever been in the entire past. So it has a very healthy future, I think. Maybe not as big as what it was, but certainly very healthy. We also have several museums dedicated to the topic: Circus Museum of Baraboo, the John Lebo Ringley Museum of Art in Sarasota, International Circus Hall of Fame in Peru, Indiana, and collections of circus at many other different locations within our country. There are several organizations that one can join to further your interest in the circus: Circus Fans Association, Circus Historical Society, Circus Model Builders, windjammers who recreate music, like you maybe heard when you came in today. A couple of special publications, Spectacle and Circus Report, that give you up-to-date news on the activities within the circus business today. So I think, like this cartoon says, still with us is the circus after 176 years. Well, the time period is even greater. It's now from 1793 to 2010. It's about 217 years that it's been with us, and it's still going to be with us in the future. I think so long as there are people who want to relive the innocence and the happiness of their childhood by going to the circus, you'll see this happy circus in America. And as they used to say, folks, that's it. It's all over now. If you have any questions, I would be glad to try and answer them. Yes.
One of those slides you showed, it was said 5 cents. What does it cost today to get into a comparable circus?
The gentleman said that it looked like there was a 5-cent indication on the price of the circus ticket, and how much does it cost today? It might have started out at 5 cents, but for the heyday of the circus, usually the pricing structure was 50 cents for an adult, half price for children, about 25 cents. And that lasted from probably right after the Civil War until about the 1930s, and that's when prices started to rise. I think today, I don't know specifically what the prices are, but my guess would be that if you would go to a Ringling performance today in a modern arena, you're probably looking at certainly no less than $15 a ticket, and probably more up into $20 to $30 a ticket. It's much higher. But you get entertainment that you don't see anywhere else. If you want to go upscale from there and want to see a circus-like performance, you can go to one of the Cirque du Soleil shows in Las Vegas or Chicago or Florida, and there you're probably looking at ticket prices of $100 to $200 a ticket. It's wonderful entertainment, it truly is. But they don't have a ring, no ring. Yes?
Is there Ringling stock available to buy?
The question is if there's Ringling stock available. At one time, after Mattel bought the circus, and they owned it for a period, you could buy stock in the circus. But after the Feld family bought it again the second time, it became a wholly owned subsidiary of Feld Entertainment. So today, unfortunately, you can't buy stock in the circus, but you can buy some of the old stock certificates that were sold. Well, those only cost you about $1,000 for the piece of paper. Yes? Oh, yes.
What is a hippodrome?
What is a hippodrome? A hippodrome is usually an oval-shaped area wherein you stage horse acts, horse presentations, and so on. In the circus, the hippodrome is usually known by the phrase hippodrome track, and it would have been the oval track that surrounded the rings and the stages where the principal parts of the performance were staged. And what the circus would do, they would do a grand entry around the hippodrome track, and then enter rings and do their displays and so on. But at an earlier time, what they also did was the hippodrome track was the location where they staged the chariot races. These were really thrilling races that closed out the show, and I can tell you, these are tremendously dangerous. People were killed. You know, any of you seen that movie Ben-Hur? I mean, it wasn't quite like that, but these are people, you know, giving full rein to horses, charging around this track, racing one another. And if you've heard of the star Gunther Gable-Williams, the man named Williams, from whom he took his name, died as the result of injuries he received in doing a chariot race in Germany. So that's what took place on the Hippodrome track.
The reason I asked is my uncle was involved with running old Conestoga wagon type wagons in a hippodrome, and I didn't know what it was as a child, and learned that these very speedy running things happened, and as you said, it was very dangerous.
Yes. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.